common axiom is that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Another axiom is that we sweat in peace so that we don't bleed in war. Here at the Marine Corps Association, we fully understand both. That is why we offer through our professional development page on our website a comprehensive catalog of battle studies, tactical and ethical decision games, and war games to ensure that not only do we learn from the past, but we embrace the thoughts and decisions that influence the outcomes of some of the greatest actions of the Marine Corps. We have tools and techniques that will enhance both unit training as well as enable comprehensive self study. Check out all that the Marine Corps Association has to offer on our website. Go to mca marines.org/professional development. That's mca marines.org/professional development and get your reps and sets in. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners, thank you for joining us. I'm Vic, and I am so appreciative for this week's guest, not just because of what an amazing story that he's going to be sharing with us, but because this will be the second time that he gets to share it with me. It turns out we had an unbelievable conversation about a week ago. Unfortunately, it was just between the two of us because in all of my vast professionalism and experience here as a podcaster, I forgot to hit record. And so here we are again. But I keep telling myself, I've been telling myself this for about a week now, that it was such a great dress rehearsal that the execution part is going to be just absolutely off the charts. So I made sure to hit record. And Mr. Jose Torres, thank you so much again for being with us today.
Vic, it's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I think it's going to be fun. I look forward to it.
Yeah, I have as embarrassing and sort of punch to the gut as it was. I have been looking forward to doing this again with you because it was such a great conversation. And so, just for our listeners, um, Mr. Torres, Jose, he goes by Jose Torres Pabon. He is known as that if you were to go to Amazon.com, and we'll link um, to in the show description when this is released. But Jose is an author. He's a retired Marine. In his time in the Marine Corps, he was straight leg infantry in the early 80s, then went to recon, then to force recon. Then he dove into the word scramble of government agencies. And now he is the author of the book When Colonialism Wins, The Case Against American Statehood for Puerto Rico. And he spends his time in retirement advocating for Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. Again, Jose, thank you for joining us. Let's just go ahead and dive in. Your career is so fascinating. The events that you were, directly privy to are historic, especially from an American perspective, but also internationally. So why don't you tell us a little bit? My kids have been studying the Cold War, and so we've been sort of recapping a lot of like the 50s and 60s, post World War II, the Berlin Wall going up, like what that meant. And you were in the thick of it. So yeah, please tell us about your background, where you're from, and what brought you to the Marines.
Well, Vic, as we spoke before, I was a Marine for 20 years. Uh, I was an O3, an infantry Marine. Started as an E1 in Paris Island. Uh, and from there went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and stayed on the East Coast, deploying out of the East Coast. As you know, you never really stayed in the East Coast.
Right.
So,
Temporary lodging.
yeah, so it was my first 20 years doing that. I had the privilege, to serve alongside other Marines, in different theaters. different operations, as you will see in the book. Uh, and then I retired in the year 2000, prior to 9/11. Once 9/11 came, then I went back to work. Started working for CIA, and then I ended up working for the Department of Defense eventually, and retired from working for the Department of Defense in the year 2020. My last assignment was in Colombia as an attaché at the embassy there. So it was 40 years of service that gave me the opportunity to to work around the world, doing the things that we Marines do, and later federal service officers do. And I consider it a privilege and an honor to have been able to serve.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your service and everything that you've done. Um, but so, because I think your story, you definitely the narrative thread kind of comes full circle. So, could you talk to us a little bit about where you recruited out of, how you grew up, where you grew up?
Certainly, certainly, Vic. The Marine Corps has a very effective recruiting program in Puerto Rico. I joined the Marines in San Juan. I am from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised there. Joined the Marines in the 1980. Actually, 1979, I went into the delay entry program. Went to boot camp in 1980, and I arrived in boot camp. It was not my first travel experience out of Puerto Rico. I have traveled before, in sport competitions out of Puerto Rico, but this was my first time immersed in what really turned out to be a completely different culture. I arrived in boot camp as a proverbial, wide-eyed 17-year-old, standing on the yellow footprints, not understanding one single word of English. I had no idea what the drill instructors were saying to me. Uh, and to be fair, probably the other recruits didn't have any idea either.
Yeah.
As you may know, drill instructors kind of speak their own language, and it takes everyone a little bit to get to understand precisely what is being conveyed, as part of the program. And so that was my first experience in the Marines, coming out of Puerto Rico, 17 years old, uh, not able to speak or understand any English. All the testing that we did, MEPS, for the recruiting process, was in English. So English is taught in Puerto Rico, K to 12, and but it's in an academic setting, and you don't really get to practice the conversational aspect of it. So when we did the written test for entrance, which I did not do for the Marines, I actually was almost went into the Navy. That's another story. Uh,
Yeah.
all of that was in English, and I understood very well. However, once it came down to listening, conversations, it was another story. So it took me a while to get accustomed and figure out how to navigate. That it's a process of listening to what the instructors were saying, watching what the other students were beginning to do, figuring out what it was that I was supposed to do, and then doing it faster so I can finish about the same time as everybody else, so I don't get highlighted. And that worked. That worked for a while until I finally got to understand a few words and able to communicate a little. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that's such a yeah, no, that's so funny. I love that that you mentioning that, although you didn't really understand what the drill instructors were saying. Um, I think that's a very common thing for any recruit. I know, even at the officer level going into OCS, um, there's no, as much as you will work with your recruiter, your OSO in the delayed entry program, whatever way that you come in, they'll give you sort of some classes and get you as familiar as they can with what's going to happen. But when someone's shouting at you and they're just shouting it over and over, and you just start moving and you keep getting shouted at, and then you do something else, and then they don't shout as you quite as much, you're like, oh, okay, I guess that's what this means now. So yeah, it's not really a like a language. Like everybody has a language issue when they show up to recruit training.
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
really did not. To be honest with you, I did. It wasn't that much of a disadvantage.
yeah,
I ended up getting promoted out of boot camp. And going to what was then ITS, the School of Infantry. Uh, Camp Gagger back then, and then I went to a third battalion of 8th Marines. Ended up in Kilo Company, 3/8,
yeah.
where I spent a couple of years there before going to Second Recon Battalion.
Yeah, so it's almost as if you had gotten um, a free sort of DLI full immersion instruction period for learning English.
That is one way to look at it, and I think that everyone that comes out of Puerto Rico, goes through the same process. Everyone goes through some sort of a culturation process.
Mhm.
Learning the new culture of the Marine Corps, and it stays with you.
Yeah. What was that like? Speaking of that sort of that all of that transition, all of that cultural understanding. Obviously, boot camp, entry level training is designed to sort of tear down that individual, build it back up. But for the vast majority of us who go in, there's our like one of the common features is that even though obviously military culture, marine culture in particular is very different than civilian culture, it's at least has a common understanding of what, I hate to use the term to be overgeneral, but like Americanism. uh, um you coming from Puerto Rico are American, but within the cultural context it is different though than what us coming from the continental United States experience. And so what was that like for you having to learn learn the language on the fly, understand what continental American worldview is like, and then also then what how like to then put that into a marine context? Or was the marine context just so different that the other stuff other than the language, it was sort of transparent to you?
Well, Vic, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. It's as you mentioned, Puerto Ricans, anyone born in Puerto Rico is an American citizen at birth, and that is since 1917. But the culture, we are all American citizens, but the culture is quite different. Uh, I would compare, the cultures between the southern, perhaps United States. Take a state of Texas, for example, and if you go to the Northeast, we're all Americans, but we have quite a bit different culture to speak of.
Mhm.
The different way to look at things. When you speak about liberty and freedom, for example, that might have a different context in the state of Texas than it does in New Hampshire, perhaps. So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is the same with Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans are a people, a culture that is a mix of or a combination of different cultures. You have the original native Arawak, Taino Indians, and then you have the Spaniards, and subsequently you have the African culture that was brought into the island very much in the same way that was brought into the United States. So those three cultures mix over a period of 400 years, and in the last 100 years, then you have the American culture. So you have a fourth element. So over the 500-year history of Puerto Rico, which we today we are engaged in the argument of in the colonial argument. So over the 500 years of that history, you have a true mixing bowl of cultures and peoples and bloodlines, that yield what it is the Puerto Rican today. And people in Puerto Rico, they look at it, with a lot of pride. They believe that they are their own people, their own culture, their own language and music, and their own country. Perhaps. So that's, we wave the Puerto Rican flag. You see that very often everywhere. Puerto Ricans are very quick to bring out, the Puerto Rican flag, as they present their blue passports, at the airport.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
so, uh, so that is very true. In my specific case, arriving in boot camp, I had a little bit of an advantage, Vic, because of my upbringing. The way that I was brought up, uh, sort of looking back at it, gave me a little bit of an advantage. I was brought up in a household where there was discipline and there was love. There was faith, there was hard work. There was a series of values that were instilled upon us, as kids, that were very similar. And you read about this in the book as I narrate my story. Uh, the- those values of hard work and earning what you get, and studying and examining, analyzing, respect, faith, uh, you know they were not very different from the values that the drill instructors were trying to instill upon us. That discipline. I practiced sports, I boxed, and I did martial arts for many years, represented Puerto Rico overseas in tournaments. So that physical uh, yeah, rigor, that's the sports background, combined with the discipline and the values that were taught at home, sort of gave me a very solid foundation to then, when I joined the Marines, that aspect of the culture was not a shock. My household are very patriotic, uh, and so that I brought that with me as well. So in my particular case, that aspect was not as shocking, as it were other perhaps more mundane, more current day-to-day aspects, of living, and interacting, like the conversational aspects and so forth. Uh,
Yeah.
so once I overcame that, I honestly, if I may, I honestly looked at being from Puerto Rico as an advantage, because it gave me additional cultural perspectives, and later on, and the ability to speak other languages. I spoke Spanish first, then English, barely now, but it gave me the ability to communicate uh, with others in a manner that gave me a wider perspective. And it was really helpful when I was working overseas, as a Marine and later as an intelligence officer, when I was working with other countries and foreign forces and foreign partners. It gave me a cultural sensitivity that I've always felt, that was an advantage to me. So I feel very fortunate in that respect.
No, that's I definitely feel and granted it's anecdotal, so it wasn't this isn't a double blind placebo,
Sure.
test case, but I found mostly especially during the long war when we were doing counterinsurgency, that my best embeds were Marines who came from multilingual, multicultural families, because it was just so seamless to just take them, drop them into, some HESCO fort with Iraqis or Afghans, and give them a couple weeks to sort of feel each other out, and then they were off and running because there was a certain level of yeah, cultural understanding, even if it wasn't directly related to that culture, but just having to navigate any sort of cultural landscape that was, heterogeneous. They just sort of had it seemed like they had an innate ability in themselves to be very malleable Also, if they were bilingual or multilingual, there's just it seemed like there was an aspect of their brain that helped them pick up the language quicker too. Um, something that gets turned on from your youth, that just is hard to turn on later on in life. I know I struggle with all the times that I've tried to learn foreign languages.
Yeah, absolutely. As we dealt with, really for almost 20 years, in Afghanistan and as well as in other places, with the irregular uh, forces that we then try to conventionalize in some cases. As we dealt with those irregular forces, that cross-cultural aspect of that unconventional type of warfare is already, those folks that come from other cultures, already bring that uh, training that we provide. It's already part of their being, part of their who they
Right.
are. So yeah, it's a little bit, it is something that we train also, but those guys come with the training, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. So speaking of culture, and I want to reiterate this because as we talked as we were getting ready for this episode, my wife and thus the future of House Ruble is inextricably linked to Puerto Rico because my wife is Puerto Rican, um, and I've been and I try to provide grace because I understand that, like, especially when we're talking about the Caribbean, between Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, all of the various Caribbean islands. There's this understanding that basically anything south of Florida and southeast of Texas, those are different countries. And so they get a lot of my wife would get a lot of questions like, "Oh yeah, when did your family immigrate?" Or how hard was it for you guys to get a visa to come to the U.S. And um, so I do want to reiterate that, like, yeah, exactly. When you are from Puerto Rico and you go to fly to continental United States, you have a blue passport. It's that simple. It's just like flying from DC to Nashville. But that being said, though, there is a cultural dynamic. I know from within the Asian community, there's a very clear differentiation between those who were born and live in Asia and those who are Asian American. The book Just Americans about the Japanese soldiers that volunteered out of the internment camps and fought in Europe talk about this dynamic of the continental United States Japanese Americans who went to Hawaii and linked up with the Hawaiian Japanese Americans, and there was a lot of animosity, a lot of conflicts initially as they were getting used to each other because they were just culturally so different. Even in the way that they would speak English was different. How about for you as you came to the U.S.? Obviously there's a wide diaspora of Puerto Ricans, with some of the biggest enclaves being Chicago, New York, Miami. What was that like for you to come to Paris Island, enter the fleet, and to meet Puerto Ricans who were maybe have never been to the island before? What was that like for you?
Yeah, Vic, you got a couple of great points you brought up there. Let's talk first about the first one, and you're very correct. Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean. It's 100 miles long, 35 miles wide, in the tropics. Beautiful beaches. The food is incredible. If you ever have the opportunity to eat Puerto Rican food, is quite different. It's
Neve, that's my jam.
Yes, absolutely. The music, the salt water, the air, the place. If you want to visit a tropical paradise to speak of, then you don't really have to fly around the world, to the Pacific Islands. You can just go to the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, and you don't need a passport to go there. All you need is your driver's license and just fly in there because it is a U.S. territory, since 1898, really. So that's a really great point that you bring. In my case, uh, you know, joining the Marines there, as I spoke before, it was an opportunity for me. That I didn't really mean to join the Marines for 20 years. I don't think anyone really does when they first come in. And so I came for 4 years, and then ended up staying 20 years. I, you know, I the Marine Corps in the 1980s, Vic, was quite a bit different from the military overall was quite a bit different from the way the
Mhm.
military is today. The 1980s, 1970s, it's coming out of the Vietnam War. We had the Marine Corps was not immune to the social pressures, that were present in the country at the time. So we had those the same, social issues, and that the rest of America was experiencing, and it could have been, it was quite difficult at times, dealing with those social, racial pressures. In my case, those racial pressures that were present at the time, where I'm going to just say demons that I did not allow to exist in my reality. Uh, I just did not feed into that, and it never became present in my life, in my reality. Uh, but yeah, being in the infantry back then, it was tough. Our first couple of deployment, my second deployment was to Beirut, in 1982, 1983. In that, we were very fortunate by then. We had President Reagan that had come in, and he had really done some positive things to change, and we have began to see a change in the military, for the better. So it was pretty tough. I really enjoyed it. I felt very comfortable. I felt a little bit restrained, if you will, in the infantry. I felt I was not really happy. I felt like I was not really applying all my skills and abilities. So once I transferred to the reconnaissance community, I felt more comfortable. I felt that I was able to perform to my full potential. And that's probably why I stayed in the Marines. I always told myself every time that it came time to reenlist, I said, I'll reenlist as long as I like it. As long as I continue to love what I'm doing, I'll stay in. And I stayed in 20 years. So that is true. The same thing kind of applied in the civilian service. We were at war. When I retired from the Marines and joined the intelligence community, I kind of stayed doing many of the same things that I was doing in the Marines. So although I retired from the military, I didn't really retire. It took me
Mhm. Yeah.
40 years, 20 years later, several deployments to Afghanistan and other locations, as you read in the book. I'm retired in Colombia, which gave me having a diplomatic assignment there gave me a very wider perspective, even, from that. I went to Puerto Rico when I retired to try to reconnect with my family, with my roots. I've been gone really almost nonstop for 40 years almost. And when I went back to Puerto Rico in 2020, what I found was disheartening. I ran into Puerto Rico is in a dire situation right now. It's in dire conditions. They were hit by a couple of hurricanes that were devastating. They have had some earthquakes, a number of natural disasters that destroyed the infrastructure. We had some very bonehead, if I will, decisions by the government that placed the island billions of dollars in debt. We have had, presently issues with crime and corruption and drugs, migration forces that are also applying pressure. So when I went back to Puerto Rico, it really reminded me of some of the places that I served overseas, in conflict zones, the destruction that I found from the hurricanes, the corruption, the criminality. It was really similar to other locations that I served, in high risk areas. So it sort of made me feel bad a little bit, actually not a little bit, a lot, because I told myself, or I thought, I spent 40 years going all over creation, trying to bring democracy and peace and prosperity and stability to people around the world. And then I go home when I retire and it's a mess, you know. So what happened? I said, if our home front is not safe, if we're not safe in the home front, then how good is anything that we do overseas? That's the whole purpose of us going away to faraway lands, to do whatever the things we do is so we can keep home safe. But home was not safe. It was really destroyed, by natural and man-made disasters. So
Sure.
that's what brought me to the writing of the book When Colonialism Wins.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting perspective of things. You know, I've been to Puerto Rico. I've really enjoyed it. It's gorgeous. But I do echo some of the stuff that you're mentioning. And it's sort of a shame. The cynic in me is going to come out here. But it's rough to see that US citizens, because I wonder, I don't have any answers, and I'm not going to try to pretend to occupy someone else's headspace, especially politicians. But I wonder if we had these conditions in Indianapolis or in I don't know, name your Kansas City or St. Louis. If we had these sort of conditions at this scale, if we would be so willing to turn a blind eye or just be straight up just ignorant to it. Obviously people aren't burying their heads in the sand if they don't even know what's going on. But the fact that it's not in the public consciousness, it's not something that is featured on headlines on CNN or Fox News. Um, unless you're speaking to an advocate such as yourself, or you're a member of some NGO like Doctors Without Borders or Habitats for Humanity or something like that, you could be completely unaware that there are these conditions that American citizens are having to go through every day. But yet, um, it takes someone like you who is, like you said, gone overseas, been in conflict zones, been in war zones, fought in war for over 40 years to come home and then see it and go, holy shit, I had no idea that this was going on here.
Yes, Vic, it is true. In 2019, this special agent in charge of the FBI office in San Juan declared a crisis of violence on the island, and it's only gotten worse. If earlier than that, the NIH, the National Institute of Health, warned us in 2016 of an impending health crisis coming in Puerto Rico, it come to pass and it's gotten worse. People in Puerto Rico are dying at a rate 11% higher than the rest of the nation. So yes, the conditions are not very good. We may or we may not always agree with the policies of the current administration, but we can't say, one of the things that we cannot say is that they have ignored the problem in Puerto Rico. The current administration and the administrations before have been responsive by providing Puerto Rico with financial resources to 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 fix the problem. We Puerto Ricans on a per capita have received more federal assistance than any other state of the union. All right, so we are our government is trying to help by pumping in funds to reconstruct. So much so that only 14% of all the money that has been pumped into Puerto Rico has been used thus far. The government has only used a limited amount of the money that's available. So, so, so we have tried to help. But the problem, Vic, is that the problem in Puerto Rico is not just an economic problem that can be solved by pumping in money. It is a problem that transcends, you know, disciplines. You have cultural issues, you have psychological issues, and we address some of these in the book. We have cultural issues, we have economic issues, We have a number of we have political issues associated with the status of the island. So all of those pressures, play into the problem. So if you can't solve the issue of Puerto Rico by just looking at it as an economic problem, because then you're going to miss out on the other pressures that are going to continue to affect the people of Puerto Rico. You really have to take a transdisciplinary, comprehensive look at the island, and that is what we try to do. In our book, we try to look at the psychological issues, at the cultural issues, economic issues, social issues, political issues, and we try to synthesize all of that to make assessments of what Puerto Rico is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. The assessments are not really great, uh, but that is what we did. We provided some solid recommendations as to the way forward.
And so one of those things that you mention in your book is the thing that seems to be the first. It's the first thing that seems to get cut, right? And that's education. Um, is this a because due to a lack of oversight? Are we sort of playing whack-a-mole when we should be doing, like you said, a multidisciplinary? Like, what is the issue with education? Because I think everyone will do a collective head nod when you say education should be your foundation. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so then why is that the first to get cut?
Okay, well, that is a very critical point, and it is very true. Education is the foundation, and it is one of the keys to solving the problem. But some years ago, the government of Puerto Rico. Uh, Let me take you back. Yeah, in order to understand this, you really have to look at the history a little bit. So let's move through history really fast. Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States in 1898. As a result of the Spanish American War. Uh, the U.S. established a military government, then a civilian government, and Puerto Ricans were not able to elect their own government. The U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico were not were not able to rule themselves. Until the 1950s. In the 1950s, there was a big push globally to decolonize territories around the world. The United Nations took that effort, and the U.S. received a lot of pressure in the case of Puerto Rico. So the federal government, in coordination with some people in Puerto Rico, uh, established a local government. You know, they wrote a constitution for Puerto Rico that signaled a degree of self-governance. And the pressure was relieved. The United Nations recognized that Puerto Rico was no longer a colony. But the fact is that the constitution that was established in the 1950s in Puerto Rico, which we refer to as a Commonwealth type of relationship, uh, really did not override, did not take precedence over the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which gave Puerto Rico, to the United States. Uh, so when Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States, it was not incorporated into the United States. It just remained as an unincorporated territory. Because it is a territory and unincorporated, the territorial clause in our Constitution applies. And what the territorial clause in the Constitution says is that the U.S. Congress has total ability to govern over the territory. So, notwithstanding that 1950 Constitution, the U.S. Congress makes rules over what happens in Puerto Rico, really. So that is the status that is presently. All right. So when uh, during the 1950s, also in Puerto Rico, we saw let's shift now to the economic side. And we saw a shift or a transformation of the economy in Puerto Rico. Up to that point, we had an economy that was based on agriculture. 1950s came, the U.S. government passed, in conjunction with the government of Puerto Rico, passed a series of incentives to bring industries into Puerto Rico. So 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you saw a dramatic expansion of industries in Puerto Rico, which really transformed the economy from agricultural to industrial. It was relatively easy to bring people out of the fields, where they're working, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the heat of the day, so it was not really hard to convince them to go work in a factory where it was air conditioning and they got better pay, and they had health care, and the infrastructure went along with it. So that transformed the economy. Uh, but those industries that established in Puerto Rico were there because of the incentives that the federal government and the government of Puerto Rico provided. Those incentives were not permanent, they were temporary. And during the 1990s, they went away. Once the tax incentives went away, then you saw those industries that were supporting the economy in Puerto Rico depart and go establish themselves at other uh, locations, where there was a cheaper labor and they didn't have to pay security and healthcare and all of that, and that crashed the economy in Puerto Rico. Uh, at that point in time, Vic, you gotta, if you put it in a global context, you have a Cold War that is coming to an end, and the United States is, being looked as the model of the economic model for the world. We're trying to lead the world, towards a peaceful, democratic, society. So we couldn't really afford to have Puerto Rico fail. We couldn't have Puerto Rico turn into a Haiti or the such.
Hmm.
So we began to pump more money yet into Puerto Rico in the form of social programs. We did not rebuild the economy. I mean, it's really easy to bring people out of the fields into factories. It's really hard to do it the other way around.
The way around,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we didn't rebuild the economy, and and everything crashed. For example, the fishing industry right now, there's really no fishing industry. During the 1990s, you had an industry, a tuna industry, for example. Most of the tuna consumed in the U.S. was packed in Puerto Rican process. So you had about over $600 million a year being brought into the economy. Those industries went away overnight. So we began to pump money into Puerto Rico, in the form of social programs, welfare, unemployment, but we did not really address the core issue of rebuilding or redesigning the economy. The government of Puerto Rico, people are used to a standard of living. So the government began, having lost the income, no revenue because the industries are gone. So the government began to borrow money and issue municipal bonds, to finance operations in Puerto Rico and maintain the infrastructure. It's kind of like, they got a credit card and they began to use the credit card, and when they maxed out that credit card, they went and got another credit card to pay the credit card that was maxed out and borrow more money. And that continued through the years until we found ourselves, the government of Puerto Rico, in a position where they could not pay the debt. It became unpayable. It was declared unpayable in 2015. You know, billions of dollars, over $120 billion combined debt in unfunded pension liabilities. Municipal bonds that couldn't be paid. Uh,
Mhm.
2016. President Obama passed a law to establish a fiscal oversight and management board in Puerto Rico, which is a board about 7 or so individuals that oversee the finances in Puerto Rico. It's a federally appointed. They serve a term limit and then they are replaced. But they oversee the budget. The purpose of that board, Vic, is to one, restructure that debt. Puerto Rico's not going to be able to pay $120 billion. It's just not going to happen. So they have been very successfully restructuring that debt. Uh, and then figuring out how they're going to pay what's left. So from $120 billion, I think that they restructure to about $30 billion. Which still have to be paid, but you still have no revenue. Are we still recording here? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. So you still have no income, no revenue coming in. And so what the Fiscal Oversight Management Board, the FOMB, they have the mission to restructure the debt, to pay it back, to ensure that Puerto Rico can obtain again a reasonable credit rating in world markets, and that the budget is balanced. So that is the challenge that they're working on. In order to do that, the Financial Oversight Board has, which they call it the junta in Puerto Rico, which echoes of Chile's, junta Pinochet type thing,
Right.
So,
Yeah,
so,
like
so what they have done to pay the debt is they have engaged in a process of austerity, savings and taxing, you know. So they have two ways to do this. One is by taxing and austerity measures, and the other one is by ensuring that there's growth in the economy. The latter part hasn't happened yet. So they have been imposing measures of austerity. They increase taxes, they have fees on services, and they began to defund government services. In Puerto Rico. And that's reasonable to the degree because Puerto Rico has one of the largest government apparatuses in the world. So there's a degree of reason to that. But the problem is that education, like you said, fell into that category. So they began to cut back the budgets across the board, and education fell in that. A couple of years ago, they're defunded it so much that there are reports that some schools did not receive any funding at all for a couple of years. Uh, I think that between 2018 and 2022, about 65% of all schools in Puerto Rico were closed. With the rural areas, of course, suffering the most in that area. So that was driven by austerity. Which also pushed the migration of people. So you have lowered student enrollment and as such. So yeah, the education system in Puerto Rico, including the University of Puerto Rico, has been largely defunded. They're trying to, and we talk about this in the book, like you mentioned. They're trying to increase the funding right now. I think that's great, but you really need to take a look. I mean, you work in education before, you did training, as well. I'm sure. So when you have a period of austerity and you defund education, then you lose ground. Your
yeah.
student population is going to suffer literally. That you're going to lose ground. So funding today to the levels that were before the austerity measures were imposed is not sufficient. You really have to consider how you have to do makeup, of those years that were lost, especially in the special education programs.
Sure.
You really need to take a look at the education system and redesign it. So apply some instructional designs, to figure out where you are in terms of academic achievements. And there's studies that show that the negative effects, where you are in terms of academic achievement, and then what you need to do to bring people up to speed, which is not as simple as let's fund it back to the original level. You got grounds to make up.
Well, yeah, and this is, I hate to ever sort of bifurcate anything in life. I think that we are sort of these days in particular, we tend to be afraid of nuance. But I think when it comes to education, much in the same way as like with athletics, and Jose, I'm sure you can, this will resonate with you, but it kind of is a zero sum game. You're either getting better or you're getting worse. There's no real like, oh, I'm just going to hang out and I'll just pick it up where I left off. When it comes to education, man, you're either we're doing it or you're not. And you're either, like you said, you're building upon a foundation or you're tearing that foundation down. And so it seems like in a lot of ways, as much as I appreciate having this oversight come in, but like to do it by 2016, man, the damage has been done. What does that mean then, as you're looking at this? Progress is being made, and that's wonderful to hear. But is it being made in the right areas? And I guess what I mean is that when we're is education just like getting kids in the classrooms and taking tests and having passable exams? Or are we also talking about trade? Are we talking about ways that people who have already fallen behind have that ability to come and then create with their hands, vice their heads in a way, to have that trade, those certifications or certificates that will create a work base, a labor force, so that once all of the current generation have now moved up and are we're on our way, that you have, you know, an equal footing, so that you're having the ability to create vice just a brain drain. Like everybody is now passing tests and now they're going to go off to other universities. Are we creating a workforce, a labor force that's able to sustain that growth? Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Kind of out
No,
of lane here,
yes,
but
it makes absolutely sense, and the answer is no, yes, yes. Okay, so in this case, you're in the Marines, and if when you talk to the monitor about getting orders in the Marines, right, and they offer you, hey, there's orders, you want to take this billet, in my case, when there was a choice, and not always a choice, but when there was a choice, one of the first things I would do, Vic, is I would look at the school system at the place where I was, proposed to go. You know,
right.
if the school system was good, then I was more inclined to accept those orders or not fight as hard.
Yeah.
It really came down to that. If you're moving me to a school system that was achieving, and there was low crime and the schools were great, then I talked to to my partner, my wife, then and I say, you know, this is good for the family. It is good for the kids. Let's do it. So Puerto Rico had a brain drain, the recent years with a lot of talent, especially in the medical and health and mental health fields, but all across the board, a brain drain, migration of talent, leaving the island, seeking better employment in CONUS, you know, and they talk about, let's bring that talent back. So how do you
Yeah.
do that? How do you do that? Well, the way you do that is you develop the best school system in the nation. You develop a school system and you have the opportunity, the funding is there. You cannot be any worse. It's time to redesign it from the bottom up. So you have the opportunity to redesign a school system where you can do all of the things that you mentioned, you know, and different trajectories. You can graduate a student K-12 fully capable, speaking multiple languages. No reason why a kid, in Puerto Rico cannot graduate, K-12, able to speak Spanish and English and maybe other languages as well, in addition to knowing the history and science and technology and mathematics. So if you do that investment today, you build the best school system, then you will attract the best talent that's going to help you rebuild the economy. So that is a key point in that regard, and that defunding of education also occurred in the healthcare field and other fields that are really critical.
Mm.
That board, the junta, that board, when it was appointed by Obama in 2016 and still there, that brought into the forefront the colonial argument,
Yeah.
which is the book is based upon, because what you had is the federal government, the Congress, and the president appointed a group of people to to really de facto govern over Puerto Rico. The board has the ability to overrule in some cases, and will not directly bring to court and overrule decisions made by the Puerto Rican legislature. Meaning, so the representatives of the people can decide on a course of action. The junta can override it, and then can impose upon new budgets. They control all the funding for all the institutions. You control the funding, then you control the institution. So
And I
so
think
that.
in
Mhm.
in a perfect world, the junta would be people who have interest or understanding or knowledge, experience with Puerto Rico. That's Is that always the case? Like, are we running
That
into?
that is
Yeah.
seldom the case, and there are arguments, and they're really valid arguments, that is not the case. That you have a number
Mhm.
of people that come from private industry with their own interests, that may or may not understand, that have really only apply a sledgehammer approach with austerity to fix the problem. They have a charter. Part of the law, requires them to take actions to ensure growth on the island. That has not occurred. Uh,
Yeah.
and so you have the colonial argument, really, because the Congress imposed upon the people. How do you like if Congress just put a bunch of people in your town and said, now they're gonna rule your town? Forget them city mayor, forget all of you guys. These people are gonna tell you how to do things.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and then I think for other advocates like Lin Manuel Miranda, for example, he's probably taking an extreme case, and so I want to get your thoughts on this. But he makes the argument that it's actually in the continental United States, or at least within the rich investors, and those sort of at the top. It's in their best interest for Puerto Rico to remain in debt because of the amount of money that they're making off of that interest rate itself, and that certain folks at the top, and I'm using air quotes here for the audio, um, actually would stand to lose, much in the same way as the housing market made all that money off of subprime loans. It's sort of in the same vein, is that they're hedging on Puerto Rico's failure, and that's where they've invested. Is that I don't know, is there any credence to that argument?
well, Vic, that is a reasonable argument that can probably be supported by the evidence we have. I think that is not too far off the center of the bullseye. Uh, and you have people in Puerto Rico right now, and in government positions, and contending, that have the same argument, and they are single focus on changing the status of Puerto Rico from a territory of the United States to incorporated state of the Union. And they argue that is the solution of the problem, because then you will have representation, because what you have right now is taxation, without representation to a degree, and people in Puerto Rico do not pay the same type of taxes that people in Congress do, but they do pay, taxes, well, Social Security, Medicaid, etc. So so you have a degree of taxation without representation. So they argue that by incorporating Puerto Rico into the union, then you're going to have your legislatures and your senators that are going to be able to advocate in Congress in cases like that. And there's a degree of truth to that. I mean, that's very true and difficult to argue with. That's our basis of our Republican type of government. So you can't
Yeah.
argue with that. And so now there's two uh, this legislation. There's two bills in Congress right now. Puerto Rico Status Act, as you may know, one in the House and a sister in the Senate. Uh, that call for a binding referendum next year in Puerto Rico. The bills have received considerable support on the Democratic side of the House, not so much on the Republican side of the House. In the book, we argue against these bills. To be honest with you, we I do not think that the bills are appropriate. They're good enough as they are written, because what the bills do is they're asking the American people to accept Puerto Rico into the Union based on the outcome of a 2025 referendum. All right, so which is next year. Essentially, we're
Hmm.
asking the American people to accept, the territory as equal, as an equal state. When the conditions are not equal. We have some social, economic, cultural issues in Puerto Rico that are not quite congruent, or equal with the rest of the states, and that's a problem, because
Hmm.
if today you have 60% of the people in Puerto Rico that stayed out of the labor force, out of the formal labor force, people that elect not to work or not work in the formal economy, uh, in lieu of receiving federal assistance. So 60% of the population is financing their livelihood with federal assistance money from welfare, nutritional assistance, uh, COVID, disaster relief funds, and all of that. So if you have a referendum in 2025 next year, that's 60% of the people are not going to vote to cut themselves out of the union, meaning they're not going to vote
Hmm.
to cut their own welfare checks. That vote,
Right. Right.
yeah, that vote is coerced. You can argue that it's not valid. And anytime that you have a partnership where there's not an equal footing between the partners, the relationship is unbalanced. It's not fair by design. So that
So
equal
is that
food.
the? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that equal
Go ahead. Sorry.
footing that I'm addressing is the basis that Congress has used in the past to admit states into the union or not. When they look at the territories, they use the equal footing doctrine, to say, because once you come into the union, you are on equal terms with everybody else. You get the representatives, you get the senators, you get the support, you get, and you have the same responsibilities. Meaning it's not just
Hmm.
the aid and the help that you get, it's you have a responsibility to contribute equally.
Hmm.
And Puerto Rico just cannot right now, but they will. But at this point, they cannot. So we argue that the Status Act is not quite where it should be. The Status Act should provide for a period of recovery and transition, where the people of Puerto Rico develop a reasonable degree of self-reliance, where their utilization of federal resources is near average with everybody else, and their internal production is near average everybody else. And at that point in time, when you reduce that dependency, which in my opinion is the center of gravity of the problem, when you reduce that dependency and you have a reasonable level of self-reliance, then you can ask the people of Puerto Rico reasonably to decide whether they want to join us in the union or they want to go their own way, you know, if they have that
Yeah.
ability, until if you don't have that balance, then we're asking, it's like asking somebody to marry you when they're in debt to you by millions of dollars. It,
Yeah.
it's just not really a fair thing. So
Yeah. The debt comes after, right?
yeah, that comes out. So based on that premise, we say, hey, we need to change the status in Puerto Rico. Yes, we need to do it soon, but the current Status Act is not adequate, and that's what's one of the points in the book. Yes.
Yeah, and that I think so. I guess just to be clear, your book, although titled "The Case Against American State of Puerto Rico," there almost needs to be a subtext that says "right now," because you're not anti-statehood. You're just not anti-statehood in 2025, or you're just against statehood in 2025. We're
Yeah,
not ready yet.
I think that yes, that is precisely the case. I don't want to spoil the reading,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the readers. Please pick up the book. It goes in. We talk about Beirut, we talk about Afghanistan, we talk about Israel. We talk about some operations in Colombia, and I think you'll find that interesting from that perspective. But then from the geopolitical perspective as well, you find it really interesting. So pick that up. It is the case against statehood for Puerto Rico right now, but do not believe that the case against statehood is the case for independence. It isn't,
Right.
and throughout the book, spoiler alert, throughout the book, I refrain from articulating my personal preference for either statehood or independence. When I went, whether it was Afghanistan, Lebanon, and the alphabet in between, like you said, when I went there, in my mind, in my heart, I went to help establish a degree of stability, peace, and to give people the freedom for them to be able to decide for themselves what their future is going to be. So I want to see the same thing in my hometown. You know, I wanted people in my hometown to have the same freedom that we try to give people around the world to decide whether they want to join us. And if they want to join us, it's not because of the federal aid, it's because they believe in the values that we stand for as a nation, and if they want to join us in the in the theater of other nations, as an independent sovereign state of their own, then that's fine too. They should have the freedom to decide, and the freedom right now, and that decision right now is coerced, because of the state of
Yeah.
dependency. So that is the argument in the book. Please pick it up. I think you find it interesting. We're donating. It is a nonprofit effort. We're donating all the proceeds, from the net proceeds of the book to shelters for women and children in Puerto Rico. Yeah.
And that's it's an amazing cause. It's a wonderful book. It dives into something that I get it. There's a lot on everyone's plate right now, but I do just sort of um, absent of my own personal interests in this, I would just encourage, like, these are US citizens. And so we need to carve out whatever empathy, sympathy, grace, love out of our sort of heartstrings to provide to this issue. And I think that it's such a wonderful way that you go about in this book, titling it the way you do, but then using data, like you said, and you're not um, sort of, force feeding your own personal views on this. This is something that has been collected, it has been collated, it is resourced and supported by data and statistics across the all of the ways that Puerto Rico is um, historically linked, inextricably linked to continental United States and the governance and citizenry and all of these things. It's so great, and I think it's so profound that you use your own experience as well in saying this, because if you look at sort of the history of Puerto Rico and you look at the history of Jose Torres Pabon, is you have a young man who enters the Marine Corps, gets in a fair amount of trouble, but then leads himself to then become a diplomatic attaché working throughout our government, that then comes back to Puerto Rico, and almost it's like you see your life reflected in the life of your island man, and it's so great. And I love this idea that you spent 40 years fighting for and bringing hope and freedom and ability and liberty and ability for peoples to make the decision on how they are going to live a good life and live their lives. And then you come back to your island and realize that you weren't doing that for your fellow Puerto Ricans. And that's so profound and it's so rich. I just love it. This has been such a great conversation. Jose, where can folks find you? Obviously, we could get your book on Amazon and we'll link it in the show description. But I know you're on LinkedIn. Do you have Instagram, Twitter?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn as well with my name, Jose Torres. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. The book is available online, digital form or hard copy. We have not done a voice audio book yet, we may not. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter right now. I do have an expiration date. This is not, I'm not staying in this forever. This is my effort, to help as long as I can. And then I hope to just vanish back into the swamp of the woods, and not be seen again. So, but yeah, but
Nice. Yeah.
for now, yes, you can find me uh, on Twitter and at LinkedIn, trying to advocate, and bring to light and discuss some of the issues in the book. Last time we spoke, Vic, you mentioned something to me that really was thought provoking. It really caused me to think. And it was a comment in passing that you made at the beginning, where you say, "Why did I name the book When Colonialism Wins? Doesn't colonialism always wins?"
Yeah.
And I said, and I thought about that because you made a great point, and as I thought, before this interview about your comment, I thought, well, maybe our founding fathers would disagree. Colonialism
Mm.
did not win in 1776. You know, so there's a way to overcome this. Uh,
Yeah.
Back then it was not through peaceful means. Today we can overcome it in Puerto Rico with a vote. Going to work, staying in Puerto Rico, rejoin the labor force, start working together. Everybody, as in a boat, give way together, paddling together, and then you can get this boat back on track, I'm sure. Thank you.
Man,
Thank you
that
so
is.
much for.
Yeah, no, those are great words. I think that's sort of a life hack, but I think it definitely applies here as well. So, Jose, man, we will definitely be in touch. I mean, I could sit here and talk about all of your experiences till we were both blue in the face. But maybe we'll grab a beer, something, sometime, and we will get you back on the show. And you can talk about your experiences overseas and everything that you did. But I'm so happy we were able to really dive into your book and dive into the issue here and talk about this. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming back. This was so great. And yeah, best of luck to you. We'll link everything, all of your socials and stuff. And as a former government intelligence officer, I have no doubt that when you're ready to disappear, we'll never see you again. But thank you for coming out and presenting this to us while we got you.
Thank you, Vic. I love talking to you. Take care.
The Marine Corps requires leaders of all ranks to have a deep understanding of war and the employment of force. MCDP 1 reminds Marines that the military profession is a thinking profession. Every Marine is expected to be a student of the art and science of war. It goes on to say that every Marine has an individual responsibility to study the profession of arms. Self-directed study in the art and science of war is at least equal in importance to maintaining physical condition and should receive at least equal time. The Marine Corps Association understands the critical importance of ensuring that Marines are as mentally ready for combat as they are physically ready. That is why we offer an entire page dedicated to wargaming on our website. We have recommendations for both tabletop board games as well as computer games. And for Marine Corps Association members, there is a discount code for Wargame Design Studios that you can find on the website. Wargames are a great way to immerse yourself in history and to put yourself in the shoes of the great leaders of history. Go beyond guided instruction and experience the thrill of wargaming. Check us out at mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. That's mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. Take your training to the next level.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. I am William Truding, but you've also heard the voices or contributions of Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Lichman, or Ty Frazier. The opinions expressed in this episode do not reflect the official stance of the Marine Corps, DoD, or Marine Corps Association.